Hey folks, I wanted to take this time, make this video to address an individual who is confused on both the left and the right, and that would be George Soros. Now, on the right wing, people say, oh my God, George Soros is a communist, he's a Marxist, he's this guy with lots of money who's funding leftist groups to destroy the United States and kind of stage a communist revolution. And on the left wing, you get people who laugh at George Soros and they say, ah, ha, 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 no such person exists. This idea that we're all being paid. Oh, it's so funny. The right wing are so delusional. Ha, 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 ha. Well, the reality is George Soros is a real person, but he's an anti-communist. During the 1980s, at that point, all across Eastern Europe, there were various governments led by Marxist-Leninist parties, places like Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. All throughout Eastern Europe, there were various Marxist-Leninist governments that had taken power and were presiding over centrally planned economies, and they were preaching Marxist-Leninist ideology. And that was the Cold War. There was the Soviet Union, and there was this billionaire named George Soros who was kind of a liberal, and he funded CIA-backed operations to bring down these various Marxist-Leninist governments throughout Eastern Europe. He funded them. And he was kind of a liberal. He wasn't a right-wing conservative, but that's what made it work. If he had been some kind of right-wing conservative who's saying, oh, I hate communism, I want to take everyone's jobs away, I want free market capitalism, it wouldn't have worked. You needed kind of a liberal cover in order to bring down the Marxist-Leninist governance of Eastern Europe. And so he funded these well-funded protest operations. They didn't say they wanted capitalism. They said that they believed in just freedom and liberty. A lot of them said they were for a more democratic form of socialism. They staged protests and rallies, and the result was destroying socialism in Eastern Europe. As a result, all across Eastern Europe today, you'll find huge amounts of sex trafficking, huge amounts of poverty and unemployment, life is miserable. People are miserable. The economic security that they had under the previously existing Marxist-Leninist governments has been eliminated. And they have, neoliberal free market capitalism in most parts of Eastern Europe that were formerly socialist. And this was largely the result of George Soros staging these rallies and protests that effectively, maneuvered and brought down these governments. And they appeared to be liberal, but they were liberal, but they weren't socialist. They weren't Marxist. In fact, they were a way that free market capitalism and the Wall Street billionaires could recolonize Eastern Europe. And yes, George Soros is a liberal, but he's a very, very bitter anti-communist. And George Soros funds protest movements against the government of Iran. He funds protest movements all across the world, and he works with, the Wall Street billionaires and with the CIA to try and bring down any government that gets in the way of the power of the free market system. But he does it with kind of a liberal edge. He gives kind of a Che Guevara-esque cover to it. This is a freedom struggle. This is, about bringing down a dictator. And this has happened. If you look at what happened in Libya, for example, Libya, this was that country that had the highest life expectancy on the African continent, and it was toppled. And the way it was toppled was the CIA and the West. They funded protesters, and they convinced the world this was just some glorious revolution. And so the Islamic Socialist government was brought down. The country was bombed. The country with the most efficient water system in Africa had it blown to bits. Now the place is in ruin. People are fleeing Libya on rafts, trying to get out of there. It's a complete mess. But they were able to get people to support it, and people who might otherwise have protested the toppling of an independent government in Africa, essentially the regime change operation, they were able to convince them to support it by giving it this kind of liberal George Soros-y cover. George Soros is a great friend of capitalism. He's not trying to overturn capitalism. He's the best friend capitalism ever had. He's able to kind of sell the regime change operations that secure the rule of the Wall Street monopolies, and he's able to sell them to leftists and liberals by convincing them that, hey, this is a glorious protest movement, it's hip, it's cool, he's a slick marketer. And yes, there are a lot of activists in the USA that are funded by George Soros, and that's why the left is completely, I would say, in a lot of ways, completely ineffective. When I first got involved in leftist and Marxist groups, I wanted a revolution. I wanted to overturn capitalism and create a planned economy. And I would go to these leftist meetings and I would hear, if you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. All right, we're all going to sit in a circle and talk about our privilege. And I realized that the politics that I was attracted to, the politics of William Z. Foster and Eugene Debs, and this idea that the working class should fight back and we should have an economy that works for average people, that wasn't anywhere to be found. Instead, there was this very, very carefully and well-funded, well-crafted liberal nonsense that had been funded and pushed into radical circles. So, George Soros, people have it all wrong. George Soros is a billionaire. George Soros does exist and he does fund organizations, but he's not a Marxist. He's not a communist. George Soros is a good friend of capitalism, and he's helping it to effectively rule and dominate the world.